Welcome, bienvenidos to the panel discussion, The Language of Immigration, from Rhetoric to Dialogue. My name is Olivia Ruiz, and I am going to welcome you on behalf of the Transborder Institute at the University of San Diego. Again, welcome to the panel discussion. And I don't want to take too much time right now because we've already lost a bit with these technical difficulties. But before we begin, I want to announce, before I forget, that there's going to be an earthquake drill, unfortunately, from 10 to 10:30. So there'll be a siren, and we'll have to leave the building. All right? We don't know exactly what time, but I just wanted to alert you to that. Obviously, immigration is a hot button issue. It's a divisive issue, and it's not something that is new. It's been something that has been part of American life and American history. And this panel discussion is going to reflect that. We're going to talk about the issues of immigration, but especially the question of how to talk about immigration and immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants. And already right there, I've sort of positioned myself. But right now, I think we're all set. And I would like to introduce someone who is very important for this discussion, who is Jose Antonio Vargas, and he will be joining us via Skype. As many of you may well know, Jose Antonio Vargas, Mr. Vargas, is a Filipino-American journalist working in the United States. In 2008, Mr. Vargas, while he was working for the Washington Post, was part of a team which won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news reporting. Then, in June 2011, in an essay in the New York Times, Mr. Vargas wrote that he was an undocumented immigrant. I would like to welcome Mr. Vargas. Are you online?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. So thank you for having me. And I'm sorry that I can't physically be there, but I'm glad that we have technology to hopefully make all of this work out. Can you hear me fine?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So let me start by saying that, I grew up in California. I grew up in the Bay Area in Mountain View, California, and I went to school at San Francisco State. I came when I was 12. I found out that I was undocumented after I went to the DMV when I was 16. And then the following year, when I was 17, my English teacher said I was asking too many annoying questions, that I should do this thing called journalism. I'd never heard of such a thing. So I did. I went to a journalism camp at San Francisco State when I was a sophomore in high school. And my rationale, frankly, about it was, if I can't be in this country legally because I don't have the right kind of papers, I thought it was really exciting to see my name on the paper. Because when you write, there's a thing called a byline. And I thought, okay, maybe being on paper validated my existence. And I grew up in the Proposition 187 era. I remember being in middle school when some of my classmates had to carry their green cards to school because of that law. I mean, in many ways, Prop 187 was the beginning of a lot of unfriendly anti-immigrant laws, particularly targeting the Latino community. And I remember that because I was in 7th grade. And I remember thinking, oh, that has nothing to do with me because I'm not Mexican. Growing up in California, I thought, quote unquote, illegal people only meant Mexicans because for the most part, that's what the media told me. That's what I read in newspapers. That's what I saw on television. That's what I heard on the radio when I was in the car with my grandfather. So, of course, 2 years later, when I realized that I also am documented, I was astounded and stunned that such a complicated, complex issue that is even far beyond what's happening in America. Immigration is about U.S. foreign policy. Immigration is about trade agreements like NAFTA. We're not even having those bigger conversations because we're stuck in calling people names. And as you may have heard, I spent basically a decade writing as a journalist, first for the San Francisco Chronicle in San Francisco, and then for the Washington Post for 5 years, and then the Huffington Post, New York Magazine, Rolling Stone, The New Yorker. I spent a career writing. I was so afraid of writing about immigration or being thought about as somebody who was undocumented. I hid the secret, and I lied. I kept lying. I kept lying because I wanted to work. I wanted to work. I wanted to pay taxes. I wanted to contribute to this country that I call my home. I wanted to support my family, which I've been doing since I was in college, like a lot of other immigrant families. But about 2 summers ago, I had had enough of the lies. 2 things were happening. One, I felt that my career could not have kept going. The stakes were getting higher and higher. The second thing was I was watching via YouTube and Facebook and Twitter all these young undocumented people, a lot of them in the LA area, advocating for the DREAM Act, advocating for immigrant rights. And how dare I not join them when just years ago I had shared the predicament. I graduated from college in 2000. From high school in 2000, a year before the DREAM Act was even introduced. And so I planned, with the help of a few friends, to do this very publicly. And for us, that meant the New York Times, and it meant ABC News. And from the moment I came out, and I wanted to do it in a public way, and I wanted to do it in a way that I wanted to really hit the mainstream. The goal was, you don't see any undocumented people out there in the streets protesting or holding up signs or on Facebook or on YouTube calling themselves illegal, because we are not. We can make the legal argument, which is that, to be in this country without papers is a civil offense, not a criminal one. We can make the argument that calling everybody broadly as illegal is actually imprecise and inaccurate, because it doesn't make room for the fluidity in people's immigration status, right? The fact that people have relatives and can adjust their status at some point. We can make those arguments. We can make the argument that in what other context do you call people, a group of people, that is in many ways really, for me, the most compelling argument is the human argument, because we are actually talking about human beings, and no human being is illegal. The moment we start calling each other illegal is, I think, the moment we just stop the conversation. How do you legalize people who are illegal, right? The conversation starts there and ends there, and that's it. It's a problem-centric framing and not a solution-centric framing. And this is really what I want to kind of unpack. I think as somebody who's been a journalist, as somebody who grew up in newsrooms, I spent my entire career working in newsrooms. I think the media, and there is some great work being done there, but unfortunately, for the most part, those are the exceptions. This is an issue that most of the media covers in an incredibly simplistic fashion. That's why, Governor Romney can go out there and talk about self-deprecation and not at all think about, the millions of undocumented people in mixed status families. I'm Filipino, right? I like to think we're like the Italians of Asia. We have huge families. I have a family of at least 20, 25 close relatives. In that 25 close relatives, I'm the only person who's undocumented. And guess what? Everybody's an American citizen, either born here or naturalized, and they vote. So when Governor Romney calls people like me illegal, what do you think my relatives are going to think? It's the ones who vote. He's not just alienating undocumented people. He's alienating the network and the families that we belong to. But to me, that speaks to the very isolationist and the very segregated way in which we talk about immigration. We put it in a box in our heads. We keep thinking of it as if it's nothing more than this Mexican border, that we should.
Mr. Vargas, can you hear us? He's offline.
We're gonna try to do this without an image, and in fact, what we originally envisioned was no image for the undocumented, the voice of the undocumented. So it may work out better, but bear with us with the technical difficulties. We're trying to do some. Part of the reason we didn't want to bring him here was because he was undocumented. We didn't want to expose him to the risk of being arrested, as he was arrested a couple of days ago. As some of you may know, he hasn't mentioned this, but one of the things that we were concerned about was exposing him to risk. So hopefully we can get this up and running. So we're going to try a final option here, which is to connect the microphone to the cell phone and continue with the audio. And my apologies to everyone for the technical difficulties. This is a new experiment for us, and apologies to you as well. Please go ahead. Jose Antonio?
Yeah.
All right. Can everyone hear okay? Yeah. Great. Please go ahead, Jose Antonio. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Okay, we have a technical difficulty, and you have an Asian man on the other line. There's me and an Asian guy on the other side of the line. This is not good. So I apologize for the technical difficulties. I don't know what was going on. But so let me just end my remarks by saying this. I actually think we're at a tipping point. I think we've hit a tipping point. And I say that as somebody who's been traveling around the country for the past year and a half, in places like Georgia, Arizona, Arkansas, Ohio, Kentucky. I'm actually going to Alabama in about a week and a half. We're having a big town hall meeting hosted by the Birmingham News to talk about, illegal immigration of the state. And we're inviting mostly Republican Tea Party people who agree and support HB 56. So I'm really excited about that event. But what keeps me optimistic, frankly, are young people. I don't know if you noticed that 3 weeks ago I made a public challenge to the New York Times and the Associated Press to stop using the word illegal to refer to people. I hope that this is also something that the Los Angeles Times and the San Diego Union Tribune, if they're not already, is something that they should think about. Because when you call people illegal, you're alienating a lot of your readership, many of whom come from immigrant families of all backgrounds. But to me, and optimistic is watching and working with papers, from the Arizona State University paper to the Cornell University paper to Brown University to the Michigan Daily in Michigan to UC Berkeley, many of whom have decided that they're going to stand with us and that they're going to stop calling people illegal and refer to them as illegal. In their newspapers, they're using undocumented because they find it a more neutral, less polarizing, and less dehumanizing term. And as somebody who's gay, and as somebody who kind of grew up in the Will and Grace, era, I actually think this is part of how we're going to win this conversation and elevate this conversation. Is remember now, illegal immigration is not just about undocumented people. To me, the beauty of Will and Grace was it taught people that, hey, you can have a gay best friend or a gay roommate or a gay classmate. You know somebody who's gay. You can adapt that to illegal immigration, right? And people saying, I know somebody who's undocumented. And when you talk about the issue that way, right, this is actually what this means. And I know when I came out and I said, 2 summers ago that I wanted to have a conversation about this. And there isn't anybody in this country that I wouldn't want to talk to. I've gone and done Bill O'Reilly on Fox a few times. I've even done Lou Dobbs. There isn't anybody, so long as you want to actually have a common sense, pragmatic, civil conversation about this, tell me where to go, I'll go. And to me, having that elevated, broadening conversation doesn't include calling people like me illegal, because I'm not. Because no human being is. And we are, after all, arguing about pieces of paper. And I think sometimes we lose touch of that. So, well, thank you so much again for making me a part of this, and I apologize in advance for the technical difficulties. So, thank you. Hello?
On the contrary, Jose Antonio, thank you so much for being with us and for bearing with us on the technical difficulties. My name is David Shirk. I'm the director of the Institute, and I'm really pleased that you could join us today.
Well, hopefully I can be in San Diego soon, and I can see some of you guys in person.
We'd love to have you here. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Well, all right. Now we're going to have another guest speaker, Mr. Peter Schrag, and I'm very pleased to introduce him, a journalist of many years, much experience, with his own history of immigration as well. He has worked along the border, El Paso. He worked in the East Coast in Massachusetts, teaching. And he has been working at the Sacramento Bee for a number of years, also contributing writer to The Nation. And he's written a wonderful book, Not Fit for Our Society, The History of Nativism and Immigration, and I am very pleased to introduce him. Mr. Schrag?
Fellow immigrants, it's a great pleasure to be here on this campus where I've been before. Can you all hear me? This is not too much of an echo. Yes, I too am an immigrant. I'm a refugee from Germany, from Hitler. I came here when I was almost 10. Before that, I lived in Germany, in Luxembourg, in Belgium, got out with a very long sort of classic war story that I won't bother you with. In one way or another, of course, we're all immigrants, or the children of immigrants. Anyway, to go back to Mr. Vargas's very courageous position on essentially coming out, as it were, and I think the analogy with being gay is in fact not all that inappropriate. It is a courageous position he took, and particularly for him because he's in fact, because of his age, he's in fact in a sort of limbo because he does not qualify for the DREAM Act, and so he puts himself at even more risk in terms of the future. Anyway, what he says about the use of the terms is very appropriate. But let me say, as a journalist, and I share, those of you who haven't seen it, Lawrence Downs of the New York Times is an editorial writer at the Times and writes about immigration, did a piece about 3 weeks ago in which he kind of confessed that he uses illegal immigrant, undocumented, alternately, and I think many of us do, because the term you use, it seems to me, pretty much identifies you. It identifies you on which side you're on. If you say undocumented immigrant, you are on, shall we say, the liberal side or the permissive side. If you say illegal alien, then you're certainly on the conservative side. So I think many of us, and I'm one of them, I confess that, use those terms alternately as a way of somehow verifying our own neutrality on a particular controversy. But I have the same pain in using the word illegal as Downs does and as others do. And of course, there are even more gradations. There's not just the use of the word illegal as an adjective, but also the use of the word of the illegal as a noun, which makes it even more pejorative when you say illegals or he's an illegal. Then it becomes even more pejorative. But and that I think troubles me even more. But having started in El Paso as a journalist back in the 50s, in a very different era, I also remember when the general term was wetbacks, and that one has gone out of use pretty much, and I think that is in some strange way encouraging. Not that I think we should cheer it, but it's a sign of some kind of progress. But going further into the idea of illegal, I don't know how many of you have read May Nye's writings. She's a historian at Columbia who's written some wonderful stuff about the culture and the legislation regarding illegal and defining illegal. And she points out that through policy and law, we have created the illegal, and through policy and law, we can also uncreate him. And that this is not something that is in the nature of things. And those of you who have followed immigration history in this country know that that in each generation there's a new set of unwelcome immigrants, going back to the Irish, the Germans, the Italians, the Jews, the Slavs of 100 years ago, the Armenians, the Greeks, the Turks, going through now to Latinos, and that what is now being said by the anti-immigration people about Latinos, whatever name is used, is very much the same thing that was said about other immigrants 100 years ago, and still other immigrants 50 years before that. In the 1740s, Benjamin Franklin worried that the Germans arriving in Pennsylvania would Germanize Pennsylvania and would make German the official language, and English would be driven out. He changed his mind later, but it gives you some sense of how far back these things go. So I think and obviously the use of the word illegal as a noun, particularly as a noun, becomes a synonym for a lot of other pejorative things. And somebody said she remembered, I think even down here, when there was talk about dirty Mexicans. And I think illegal, or the noun illegal, is in fact, to some extent, a kind of synonym for that reference. And it certainly is horribly pejorative. And it does make the target, the object of that term, in a way invisible. Somebody, as Mr. Vargas said, you don't have to deal with, you don't have to treat with him or with her. So I think it's, and I'm slowly coming around to the notion that I probably shouldn't be using the word illegal or the adjective illegal as an illegal immigrant because it is too pejorative, and it does make the person described in some way invisible. And so, and as I say, maybe like Barack Obama about gays or gay marriage, I'm also in transition. But it seems to me that I think many of us used it over the years as a way of verifying our neutrality on the issue, so that we were objective about the debates about immigration. Though, in fact, if you read my stuff, I'm very much on one side of that issue and not on the other. And I think that, I think within a couple of years, maybe 5 years, just judging myself, I think the phrase illegal immigrant or illegal alien will probably begin to disappear from our press. Thanks.
And now we'd like to begin the panel discussion. Begin the debate, the conversation about the language of immigration. And we have, I've already introduced one of our panelists, Mr. Peter Schrag, And I would like to introduce the other two people who are with us today. We have Anthony Marquez, who is the bureau chief from the Associated Press, and Hugh Can you hear me? Yeah? Is it? Yeah, all right. And Hugh Fan, who is a team editor from the Union Tribune here in San Diego. So why don't we begin the conversation? I'm going to go back to and sit down, and we can begin to talk.
Can you hear us? Yeah, I'll just open by saying, first of all, there seems to be a common theme from comments made so far that it is probably a crossroads time for a discussion on this topic. And I really identify with what Jose said, being both an undocumented immigrant and a gay guy, and I am also a gay person, that he used the word coming out. And I think the word coming out is sort of applicable to all the different themes that we're talking about today. This is probably the right coming out time for the debate. You see it at local levels, you see it at the state, you see it at the federal. There's a lot of activity happening on so much of the grassroots level in what our immigration reporter, Elizabeth Aguilar, who's here, writes about too. You see so much of that vigor happening. And depending on, my belief is, I think the struggle is what Peter was saying. You have your personal opinions, and then you have your opinions as a journalist. And then you also have your opinions as an editor of the newspaper that you work for and of the media organization that you work for, which, despite whatever you might believe, is influenced by the ownership of that organization, directly or indirectly. And so how you balance all of those things is a struggle all the time. But my personal belief is language is a dynamic, evolving thing. It never, ever stays the same. I look at the AP Style Book, I look at the Oxford Dictionary, I look at Webster's, and if you look at every year, there are dozens to hundreds of new words that come into the vernacular and that also disappear. And I do think it's only a matter of time, as Peter said. I don't know if it's 5 years or more or not, that we will have a changing use in the media. What that new word will be, I'm not quite sure yet. There's probably a profusion of terms being considered, but I think it's only a matter of time and not really a question of whether it will change or not change.
So thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. It's a beautiful campus. It's the first time I've set foot here, even though I lived in San Diego for a year when I went to San Diego State. I was busy. I thought it'd be good to talk about a couple things. I mean, I think you make some good points about how tough it is to be a journalist, to be a reporter, because you're right in the middle of hot-button issues. Immigration is one of them, but there are a lot of others. And, you know, the terms you use, the facts you use in a story, the stories you decide or try to do, you get criticized either way. I mean, on these kind of issues, you're criticized because you use a certain term or you don't use a certain term. And so it's very hard. It's very hard for a journalist. And I would say what Peter was talking about, one of the things that also identifies you is, in terms of the term you use, is the news organization you work for. Like, you know, newspapers or TV stations or whatever have policies that range from the ethics, issues like ethics, to, you know, use of certain terms. And you pretty much have to follow them if you're a journalist for them. And Mr. Vargas, I'm sure, had to do that when he worked for the Times. He's outside of that now, so he can speak more freely. But when you're a journalist, you really have to try to follow the policies of your news organization. That said, I want to talk a little bit about the AP Style Book to make sure that, because everybody here, I mean, I know everybody here is not in journalism, so you might be curious about that. So the Style Book is essentially a guide of not just use of terms, but some definitions of terms, some context on things, and some explanations for journalists. And it is targeted at AP journalists. And that's all. It's been around for many, many years. And that's what it is. It's sort of a policy guide, as well as a usage of certain terms. that has targeted AP journalists. Now, over time, other news organizations have come to rely on it. And so that's sort of the way it works. And news organizations outside of the AP can choose to rely on the style book and use those entries as their own, or they can ignore them and and have their own. And sometimes, a lot of them, sort of, it's a mix. They'll use some of them from the AP style book, and they'll have their own version for themselves. Can you still hear me okay? So that's how the style book works, and we have a small committee of people that review the style book and all the entries in the style book, every year. They're constantly looking at it, and they're constantly actually looking for any feedback. It's not like they close themselves up in a room. They'll reach out and talk to, professors, consultants, and they're open to hearing from anybody. So apstylebook.com is the website, and I think there's a link in there so that if you have, thoughts and ideas, feel free to weigh in, because it is a pretty open process in that regard, and that we're looking for different points of view. So in terms of the illegal immigrant is the term that the AP style book dictates for its news reporters. The entry was in fact updated last year to provide a little bit more nuance. And I wanted to, rather than getting it incorrect, I wanted to just sort of read what the changes were so that you know firsthand. So the style book says, what it said before the update was, illegal immigrants should be used to, quote, describe someone who has entered the country illegally. And now the term is also used to describe anyone who, quote, resides in the country in criminal or civil violation of immigration law. It also says that living in the country without legal permission, unquote, is an acceptable variation of illegal immigrant. So the idea was to, again, make it a little bit more nuanced, because it's not there's a lot of aspects to immigration, to immigrants, as Mr. Vargas pointed out. And, that may not be the end of it. I mean, this like I said, this is something that has been updated several times over the past 4 or 5 years, and I'm sure they're going to have to look at it again because of, the passage of new laws and so forth. And I think that's about it. Go ahead, Peter.
What does the style book say about undocumented immigrant?
Well, I talked to the two people who are the key people involved, and their point is, as was described in the New York Times column that was done as well, that the impression that leaves is it's a matter of if it's paperwork, when in fact it is a matter of a legal matter in which the law is being broken, and there's no way around it. So the idea is that you try to use as much neutral language as you can to describe that. So, I mean, if we're journalists, we need to describe the facts as they are. Now, if there's changes in the law, then the language would change as well, right?
So if you used undocumented immigrant in a story, would you be called down on it by an editor?
I think it would be, it would be, you'd have to follow the policy, the style book. Now, I should say that if we quote somebody and they use undocumented, whether it's a professor or just a regular citizen, they use that term. The policy is not to change it. So if it's in a quote, you're supposed to leave it alone.
So it seems to be there. Can you hear me? There seem to be two issues here. One is you have the rules. Say the rules of engagement within the press, and if you're told you have to use a legal immigrant, then that's what you have to use when it's your own voice, unless you're quoting somebody else. But so the issue, I guess, is how we can influence to change that, and to let them know that perhaps that isn't reflecting what's actually happening on the ground, and that illegal immigrant, the term itself, is that the reality is much, much more complex. The other day I was on a case, and I will be very, very short because I'm just moderating here, and I was talking to a lawyer about a very complicated case of a person, and he looked in his law books, and he came up with the status, because we're looking at status this year. It was non-controlled non-immigrant, which, you know, is, and that's how this person was going to get across, who's in this sort of limbo in terms of quote unquote legality, illegality, documents, undocumented. And I'm just, you know, wondering how the press can reflect that kind of ambiguity.
Well, I mean, I think a reporter, and the AP is pretty flexible about this too, when you have situations that are more complex, you know, you're asked to describe it as best you can to reflect the situation. I mean, that would be the preference to just using the term. And I think that's why the update was done, to try to, you know, allow more flexibility in describing, because, you know, immigration is also not just a U.S. issue. It's an issue in other countries. In, you know, Central America, there are issues with immigration as well. And I'm not sure what kind of terms the news organizations in some of these countries refer to folks who are coming across, you know, as immigrants as well. But I suspect it might be something similar.
I think a distinction needs to be made. Somebody from Associated Press, which is influencing hundreds of thousands of, or thousands of media organizations, including UT San Diego, operates on, it needs to be more standardized. Whereas somebody from a single entity, such as our metropolitan newspaper, the UT here, we're sort of a case study in the evolution of this usage. And I would tell you that while there may be an official policy, so our official policy is we use illegal immigrant and undocumented immigrant interchangeably. We just mix it. And it's as simple as some writers will use illegal immigrant, some writers will use undocumented immigrant. Often you'll see them littered both in the same story. It gets difficult with headlines. Our editor-in-chief, Jeff Light, who is in China, so he couldn't attend, and he sends his regrets, has banned the use of the word illegal in headlines and in subheads, which I can tell you most of our headline writers probably like pull their hair out sometimes to try to fit the word undocumented in a headline that may be one column wide, or in some cases to not use the word undocumented at all. And how do you get a point across that the story is about immigration, which is also a long word, or immigrant, to make it fit. So it's this, but a part of it is also people on the ground advocating for change. I would tell you that I think Elizabeth, she may not like me calling her out on this, is an extremely talented, intelligent person who has done a year-long fellowship, has traveled to many countries elsewhere studying immigration, and she's brought a voice, her own reasoned voice, and also very logical voice to the newsroom in saying we need to be looking at this more prominently. I think Enrique was part of our Latino Affairs Council who looked at this use too. We looked at various papers around the country. We haven't kind of made a large change in it because we're cognizant that for every person here who may be pushing for a change from illegal immigrant, there is an equal number of people, roughly equal number of people, who would like to keep it as illegal immigrant or even say illegal aliens, right? And so as a general interest newspaper, or I should say a multimedia company now, how do we try to honor all of those wishes without being racist, without being unethical, without, and also reflecting our sources? I can tell you, being a former cultures writer and columnist and being a refugee myself, sometimes it's really hard to get across the essence of somebody in 10 inches of a story. And nowadays, with shrinking news hole, when we talk about, the AP stylist here says, try to be as specific as you can in describing somebody's nationality or their case study or their life history, and that's the advice that every editor gives to his or her reporters. But how do you do that in a tiny amount of space? Or when you're asked to write more stories in a week and you have to crank them out in some cases. So it may be official in one way in policy, but it's very different on a day-to-day basis. What I would say with the UT San Diego is we're a pretty pragmatic bunch. We try to see what's happening around our community. We try to adjust. I would say if you compare just to 2 years ago, the number of instances in which we've had undocumented immigrant in our pages or on our UTTV station, which is relatively new, or online, has probably at least tripled versus a couple of years ago. Is that highly noticeable by readers? I'm not sure. We don't usually hear about it. People don't really complain about it. They tend to complain more in terms of what they see as fairness or unfairness and what type of sources we include in a story, which is also a big source of contention that I think affects the way illegal immigration or undocumented immigration is perceived. Because I think we shouldn't divorce ourselves of the notion that besides the political discussion or socioeconomic discussion, there's also environmentalism involved in this. The Sierra Club is really big on this kind of issue. There's also the issue of generational differences that come into play. So I guess what I would say is we are changing. I'm not sure if you'll be happy at the pace of change, or some people may say they're unhappy that we're changing too fast. What we can try to do is to tell people, express your stories in the fullest way that you can, and then also try to tell people that while we may fit in a certain mold, that we respect you for who you are as a source, and that we really try to treat you with the dignity that you deserve.
I think we all agree that this is a fluid situation and that we're moving from the one to the other over time. I think we all are, and I think I am. And I don't get much feedback from readers when I use undocumented. And I think that is moving. It's certainly moving in the publications that I write for, including the Bee. Though it's certainly still true that the whole country is ambivalent about the immigration issue, deeply ambivalent. If you look at the polls in California, the voters will say, yes, by overwhelming majority, by overwhelming margin, undocumented immigrants should have a chance to be legalized if they work and pay taxes and do all the right things. At the same time, people will say, but they should not get the same privileges as residents, as legal residents. Shouldn't get driver's licenses. Shouldn't be entitled to certain kinds of public benefits. And the same thing is true in national polls. On the same poll that people say they endorse SB 1070 in Arizona, they'll also say, but undocumented immigrants should have a right to be legalized. So the country is itself ambivalent and has been actually for generations. Because I have a friend at Davis who says we want workers and we get people. And so there is that larger national ambivalence, and I think it's also why, you know, we all of us on the left, I guess, say that if it wasn't for Republican obstruction, we'd get comprehensive immigration reform. I'm not sure that's entirely true. I think there is something else that's more substantive about the problems with comprehensive immigration reform. The DREAM Act, no problem. But when it comes to comprehensive reform, I think there's some other substantive issues. And I think the country itself is ambivalent. If you say the key to comprehensive reform is some kind of a foolproof ID, universal ID card with some kind of biometric data, I'm not sure that most my civil liberties friends would like the idea of having an ID card that everybody carries and having a database that is linked to it. So I think there are still some serious problems, but beyond, and I think that as Lawrence Downs, and I recommend this piece, it's called the, quote, illegal, unquote, trap, the illegal trap, and it ran in the Times, or at least on their website, at the end of September. And he pretty much says what I think we've been saying about his own use of the terms. But I think he says also that just changing the terms, and with due respect to Mr. Vargas, who I think is certainly in part quite correct, may also be that just changing the terminology will not change hearts, and that other things have to go along with it, even though I think that ultimately the change in terminology will itself reflect some change of heart.
I think that, just jump in on that point, because I think it's important, which is the terminology. You know, language is important, and I don't want to minimize it, but, you know, I've been in journalism my whole career, and I can tell you that the things that matter and that should matter to journalists and you know, the folks that they serve are more substantial things that have to do with what stories you choose to write, the angle you take on stories, the amount of facts that you pursue in a story, the number of people that you pursue in a story, the stories that you tell about people. And when you talk about changing people's heart, I mean, for a journalist, that's what it comes down to. If you can talk about an issue or a problem in a way that connects to people, regardless of what their point of view is, then it might give them some pause next time they come to some quick conclusion about illegal immigration or immigration in general. These things are much more important, I think, because, you know, I've seen, you know, you're on a table and you're talking about what stories to do, and if there's a lot of aspects to this, if everybody looks the same around that table, you're going to get the same kinds of stories. If they look, you know, if you know, we're at the table, we might, because of our different background, we might come up with a different perspective. And so it has to do somewhat with, you know, diversity within the media. It has to do with more sophisticated coverage of issues within the media. And it also has to do with sort of the feedback that we get from the people that you serve, readers and so forth, just to make sure that our coverage is more credible than it typically tends to be because of the press of time.
Yeah, I'm thinking diversity in media. Oh my gosh, another huge challenge. Gender and, well, not so much gender these days, but cultural, ethnic diversity is just an ongoing uphill climb. But I just want to go back to that point that has been brought up a couple of times now in terms of feedback from the public. If you feel that sometimes you send in an email or you leave a voicemail message on somebody's phone or such, and you wonder if anybody ever pays attention to it, what conscientious journalists do, I can't say for every journalist, and there are lots of wackos who call into us and that we will discount their reasoning if it's just off the wall. But there are many, many people who write into us with sometimes 2 sentences, sometimes 10 pages worth of comments on something. And what I think we cherish more than ever, because of our shrinking number of readers, especially in print, is that if somebody cared enough to not only read your story, but actually take time to respond to it, we at least have the privilege and the obligation to consider their point of view and as much as possible respond directly to them. And so I could say in immigration issues, there are lots of people who write in and will say, you should not be portraying these undocumented immigrants in such a sympathetic light. We need to do the following things, right? And Elizabeth, without fail, will call them back and say, we'd like to include you in future articles, right? Whether they actually take her up on that offer or not is a different matter. And she really seriously means it. I think on other issues, our editor-in-chief looks at every email that comes into him. He gets about 10,000 emails a day on average. We've talked about this. And he will print out lots of emails and send them to his topic editors for their review. He's had personal meetings with people who have been more persistent in wanting to talk with him about a particular issue, including immigration. I think when we had our downsizing when he first came, Enrique was part of the group of people who came in and talked about concerns of not having enough Latinos and Latinas in the newsroom. And I think some things came out of that, not everything that they wanted, but some things. And so just on a broad scale, you should feel that you are empowered to give input and feedback to a media organization. We're not this faceless, monolithic thing. I still get people who are shocked that we call them back and ask them about something, or we actually want to do a story about them, and they say, oh, I thought my call just went into the ether. So really, if you can take some time, let us know what you're thinking, offer us some sources. Sometimes we're just looking for people who fit the kind of story we want to write about, and would be very illustrative of what we're trying to show. And sometimes the hardest part is just finding that exactly ideal person. So, you know, invest in us, see us as hopefully a mutual communication process. I can't vouch for the op-ed pages, which can be a source of aggravation for many of you, I understand. But they also try. Joe Taylor is our letters editor, and he's really good at accepting pieces for submissions. And he also sends me on average about half a dozen a day of things he cannot include, but he thought I might want to follow up through my team for coverage. Besides Elizabeth, who also covers demographics, we have our Border Baja California reporter on this team. We have our news columnist who actually writes about a lot of profiles as a news columnist, a little harder edge profiles. We have our education writers, where issues of diversity come in a lot too, and issues of immigration also come in. So look for various ways to engage us, and don't give up on us if you feel disillusioned right now. Whether you're feeling disillusioned on the left or the right, you know, still engage us, and we do listen.
One other thing to keep in mind is that the readership of newspapers tends to be much older than the population, and therefore its attitudes tend to be older than the population. And I think that, and that may never change. It may be that as that readership dies out, our papers will die out with them. And certainly there's been a fair amount of that already. But I think that editors themselves, being aware of their readership, still tend to try to cater to those as much as possible within the limits of objectivity, whatever that may be, to that readership.
I just want to, just because I think it's useful to explain what the AP is and how it relates to newspapers, because it's different. It's a wire service. We're not a direct-to-consumer. You know, we don't have a website. We do have a website, but it's just a corporate website. We don't deliver our news directly to individuals. We deliver to news organizations, and they are newspapers and TV stations and radio stations and websites. And we were pretty anonymous for a long time, in part because when we deliver to a newspaper, they publish our stories along with their own, but they used to come out just once a day in the morning and then in the evening. And now everybody has websites, and a lot of them are automated. So when we send a story to a newspaper, a lot of time it's immediately popping up on the website, and that's why it's much more visible. And so, and we're a not-for-profit cooperative. We don't have an advertising department. Our customers are our owners, in effect, because newspaper owners began the AP 165 years ago as a way to share resources, so they couldn't afford to cover wars and send individual reporters, so they created this entity. And so, and back then there was a lot of the same sort of thing that's happening now with the left and the right. I mean, it was pretty dramatic. And so the AP, when it began, it really did have to operate as sort of a middle of the road, just the facts kind of news organization. Because we serve, news entities that are on the far left to the far right, and we still do to this day. And so that's why you won't find opinion sections or opinion stories in AP content. It's just news coverage. So I thought that'd be useful to know how that works.
I'd like just one little thing that when you are talking about the media, now it's become so vast and it's so diverse, the media itself, and the way that people get news, and the way that these terms are sort of, they make their way into people's homes and people's minds. The internet is huge, of course. But one thing that caught my attention the other night during the debates And that is that President Obama used the word undocumented worker. And I thought that was very interesting because that's a term that I like. Instead of taking the onus off of immigrant and actually trying to reflect something else of the reality of why people are coming here, which is to work. It's to make a living. And instead of focusing on the question, the legal and the law issue or the law side of it, looking at the economic issue. And of course, immigration is it's a complex issue. And these terms, they have stories behind them. I mean, they pack a lot of stuff, a lot of what goes on in the real world. And I was wondering if there any debate in the media that you are aware of about not just sort of focusing on this question of illegal, unlegal, legal, undocumented, whatever, but the question of immigrant itself. I mean, the possibility of referring to people as workers. You have undocumented workers, whatever. Is there any discussion of that?
As a generic thing, it creates difficulties because a lot of immigrants are not workers. They're their children or their spouses or whatever. So, so as a generic thing, it becomes limiting in some way. Yes, obviously, and as I quoted my friend earlier, we wanted workers and we got people. But I think you have to, that universe has to include the people and not just the workers. And so, and I don't know why Obama did it. I think it was very calculated. And I noticed it too, by the way. And I think it was very pointed. I mean, what would you do without them? Who would take care of everything? And I think that's another thing, by the way, that the country has yet to learn, is how dependent we are and will be even more so in the future on immigrants and their children in terms of the labor force. The people who are now retiring are the most skilled, most best educated generation in our history. So who is going to replace them? And we've already, of course, which is why I am so very much so passionate about the DREAM Act, because the DREAM Act is not only something for the young people who will benefit, but it represents a huge investment for this country. We've educated 1 million young people to the tune of billions of dollars, and we're really going to send them back? I mean, it's sort of like you develop this resource, then you're going to deport it. So I think the whole lack of understanding of the worker thing, and not just workers in the kitchens and the hotels and on the gardens, but I mean, Silicon Valley is largely a creature of immigrants. Most of them Indian and Chinese, but also Latino. And we don't understand that. We think of immigrants always as being the guy who works in the, does the babysitting or works in the kitchen or in the garden. But there are just, I mean, it's a huge range, and the range of education of immigrants is huge. The country doesn't understand any of that. And so I think that way, the remarks that Mr. Vargas made and the writing he's done, I think is very pointed, because it's a reminder that we, in talking about this, better, and that goes back to the Obama thing too, understand that the huge diversity of the people we're talking about, and that this isn't just somebody formerly a wetback, and now, and by the way, about between a third and half of immigrants are not people who came across the border illegally. They're visa overstayers, and they come from everywhere, and they arrived on airplanes, and they didn't sneak across the border. So, so I think just to recognize the diversity, the complexity of that, if we can get closer to that, then we'll begin to, I think, address the real problems.
I would say, in general, too, that would be hard to use the word undocumented worker. We do use it for employment business stories, but it'd be difficult to classify an entire population that way. If I had my own personal sway that would change the UT organization, I would prefer to use the word unauthorized immigrant rather than undocumented, because I also think that's an incomplete term. And it came up, there was a really good story in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, actually, an opinion piece that kind of laid out things in a really wonderfully cogent way that made me think differently about the term. But I also think the challenge that you're going to see, the main challenge to me is that illegal immigrant has been so politicized by all parts of the spectrum that there will be many people who will feel that if you change the word to anything else, that and somehow you're caving in to a particular cause, or that you're you're liberal or so forth. So I think the term, let's see here, our paper began using it in the 1920s. And it has persisted for that long, and I'm sure it started even before then for other publications. So I think we hear from people all the time about why they don't want that to go away. I would say that conservative readers tend to be, whether they are seniors or not, tend to be more vocal and more dogged in their pursuit of influencing us than others do. I am not sure that's across all topics, but certainly for topics related to Mexico and immigration, that's certainly our pattern. I would say I'm trying to go back to the practical things that you could do from attending this session. The gay community actually did something really helpful for us. It created this really comprehensive database of people in the community. So it's in San Diego County, Southern California, across the whole country, of people it felt were knowledgeable about a topic. And we thought, oh, they're going to send everybody that they think is friendly to their cause, right? The Human Rights Campaign or so forth. And yes, those groups were on there. But there were many other people of evangelical churches, of Islam and so forth, groups that are heavily opposed to gay marriage and other gay rights, who were listed on there. And they had a long explanation about why they felt these people were knowledgeable and fair enough to be quoted. Right? Do we use that list all the time? No, but we refer to it here and there. They also sent a list of people they felt were unsuitable for us to quote. Right? And we disagree with a majority of those, but some of them we actually thought, yes, they are right in it. I think that if there is anybody enterprising and devoted enough to try to help us in this regard, I think Elizabeth is a really judicious person in terms of looking around, but it would never hurt for us to get some help, and I think you could see some tangible fruits of your efforts too over the course of the future with our organization.
Down said, on your point about unauthorized, he says, I also use unauthorized, which is unfamiliar and a little clunky, but has a distinct advantage. While it acknowledges the unlawfulness of someone's immigration status, it also recognizes that his status can be fixed.
I wanted to sort of take a pause here, and to open up the discussion to all of you. If there are questions, Diana is there with a microphone.